it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our two speakers today. Sarah Ellis is currently working as Senior Manager, Assessment Services Europe for Cambridge Assessment English. She's based in Bologna, Italy. Sarah is interested in assessment, learning and professional development, and has an extensive background in teaching, teacher training, assessment and exam management. She has trained teachers on CELTA and Delta courses and currently is involved in the Cambridge Assessment English Teacher Support Programme, which provides information, materials and support for teachers and academic directors. She is particularly interested in supporting teachers in developing digital skills and assessment literacy. And Fabio Galvanini taught English for about 10 years in India, England and Spain after an MA degree in Asian Studies and Applied Linguistics. After starting work with Cambridge in 2014, he was involved in providing support, training and guidance to teachers and schools across Italy before moving into his current role as Cambridge Exams Publishing Product Manager, focusing on the Cambridge English preparation materials for the Italian market and collaboration with Cambridge Assessment English. So without further ado, over to you, Sarah and Fabio.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much indeed to everyone for joining us for this session. We're delighted that you've been able to find time to be with us in the live session. So thank you for that. And we will be, of course, talking about the 2021 ELT classroom. And many of you might be thinking, well, the 2021 ELT classroom is very similar to the 2020 ELT classroom, which of course is very true. But there is, however, one big difference, and that, of course, is what we've learned over the last few months. The coronavirus, as we know, around the world has pushed teachers out of their comfort zone, and many teachers and students have found themselves unexpectedly in remote teaching contexts, in hybrid classrooms, and using tools and platforms that they hadn't used before. And of course, this has meant a lot of challenges and a lot of questions. However, I also think there have been a lot of opportunities and a lot of learning that we can draw on. But among the many things that perhaps have changed or have altered in some way is the kind of concept of space and time. So there are two categories which, if you like, we can redefine and think about how we inhabit them, how we exploit them, and how we use them in different ways. If we reflect on these changes, we can help teachers and students be more aware of the best way to use traditional and new approaches to space and time. And that's what we're hoping to do in this session, to help teachers and learners use space and time for successful learning and teaching. We're very aware that the audience will be very mixed, and some of you will be teaching face-to-face perhaps, and some of you will be teaching completely online or perhaps in a hybrid context. So we hope in this session there will be something for everyone. We will focus a little bit more on the digital side of things, but we hope there'll be something for everyone to take away. So taking you on the journey of the session, we will be looking at defining space and time and thinking about that redefinition. We'll be looking at how we can exploit resources and perhaps allocate resources and rethink teaching and learning space, and looking at how we organize time in different ways and the best way to use it. We'll look at physical space and virtual space and the advantages that we can find in both. And we'll also look at exploring the virtual space. And we've got some nice practical activities that maybe you will be able to use in your context. We will have a short section on some of the resources we'd like to mention that you can use after the session, and we'll perhaps take you to other resources that you'll find useful. And last but not least, we'll leave some time and space for some questions at the end. So.
Thank you, Sarah. Sounds like a lot to do, and we have limited time, but I'm sure we can manage that. So I suppose a good place to start this conversation would probably be learners. So where and when are learners currently learning? How can we help them to learn in the best way possible? So let's start with a few facts from a survey recently conducted by Cambridge University Press. We haven't got time to share and comment on all the interesting outcomes of this survey, But there are a few points which are very relevant to what we are going to look at today. So the results show us that of the things students have been finding more challenging in 2020, the most challenging one is, quite interestingly, time management. The second biggest challenge appears to be motivation. The third challenge is communication. So at some point during today's session, we will be addressing all these three aspects, and we will do our best to provide some ideas and solutions to help learners and teachers overcome these challenges. During this talk, we will be asking ourselves and you various questions. So to answer some of these questions, we'll ask you to contribute proactively by typing your answers in the chat box. Sarah, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I just wanted to point out number 5, which I thought was very encouraging. I mean, the fact that 50% of learners are very positive about the fact that they are able to study when they want and they have access to a wide range of resources is very encouraging and I think very relevant. So let's start with a question. Where does learning take place? Now, this is a very broad question. We realize that. We've done that deliberately. And we'd like to invite you to write your ideas in the chat. So where does learning take place?
So, Sarah, in the chat box, we got home, classroom, everywhere, anywhere, in one's head, home, in the brain, on Zoom, and bedroom. So quite a few different answers here.
Okay, thank you for that. And of course, that's very helpful because Fabio and I have asked this question before, and we made a word cloud using a tool called Mentimeter, if you haven't discovered it. And this word cloud, of course, includes some of those words that you've just written in the chat. It's very interesting if we can kind of start to divide this space into digital space or virtual space and what, if you like, physical space. So I think already we start to see the definition of space adapting or changing somewhat. And of course, traditionally, space was classified into 2 places really for learning, if you like. The most traditional being the classroom, where students were in a shared space, the teacher was generally in control, and students were working together, probably in tandem and probably doing the same things. And homework, if you like, was tended to be done at home, independently, and probably without a lot of support from the teacher. However,
today, the scenario is quite more complex and rich, if you like. So we still have the classroom in many places around the world, but it's often a physically distanced classroom. We also have online classes happening through platforms such as Microsoft Teams or Zoom or other. And then we have learning from home and the hybrid classroom, where some students are there in presence, some are there on a screen.
Very challenging, lots more variety than we saw before, of course. What about time?
Yeah, exactly. So what about time? I suppose this is the second question of today's session. So in a moment, we'll show you a statement and launch a poll. So please respond to the poll and let us know whether you agree or disagree with the statement we'll show you in a second, or also if you're not sure about the answer. So the statement, as you can read, is to do online what we would do in a normal lesson in the physical classroom may often require more time. So please, if you could launch the poll, we'll invite participants to respond to that, and we'll look at the result in a second. I think we may be ready to have a look at the result. If you could launch that, Eve, thank you. Okay, well, a pretty varied answer. So I suppose it's a mix, half and half almost, of agreement and disagreement, and some of you are not sure. I suppose that we could say that to do online what we would do in a normal lesson may sometimes take more time. So this brings us to reconsider the use of live lesson time either face-to-face in a virtual class or face-to-face in a physical class. We may benefit from reflecting on whether some of the activities we would normally do in the face-to-face lesson could actually be allocated in a different time and in a different space. Over the past few months, we've discovered that a lot of what used to be done live in the presence of the teacher can be done autonomously by students, individually or in groups, outside live lesson time, which means away from the teacher. So this is what we are going to explore now.
Yes, in fact, it's probably useful to think about, rather than thinking online, offline, to actually think about time in the sense of synchronous or asynchronous, and we'll explore that in a moment, and space as being in the same space and in different space. Now, let me just say a little bit more about that. So when we talk about synchronous learning, as I said, not online, offline, but synchronous learning, the idea of learning taking place in real time in the same place. So if you like, the students or the teacher might be in a physical classroom, or they might be in a virtual classroom, but they're in that same space. And of course, this means that the students have access to the teacher and peer support while they're doing their assignments or their tasks. And the biggest advantage of synchronous learning is, of course, human connection. So when students are in the learning in a shared time and space, so synchronous learning, they have access to their teacher and each other. So that's very important. If we think about asynchronous, on the other hand, we can define this in terms of it occurs in different times and different spaces. So the student but working at home is the example, but learning is taking place independently away from the teacher, and learners are doing it in their own time. There are, of course, benefits of this, and including the fact that the learner will have a higher degree of flexibility. They're choosing when they do it, how often they repeat it, and a bit of autonomy. But of course, that means that teachers need to prepare them for this asynchronous context. And of course, the other benefit is that, as I said, learners can control the pace, so they can go faster or slower depending on their own individual needs. So, asynchronous and synchronous.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. That was very useful to better understand the definition. I suppose that in very practical terms, one thing we'll find ourselves having to do is to establish in which parts of teaching and learning are then going to happen asynchronously and which ones are going to happen synchronously. So this decision could feel challenging if we were to look at the overall picture of our syllabus. There are, in fact, many factors to consider. It may be difficult to make a decision based on language areas or specific skills and sub-skills. In fact, we can't really decide that one language area or one skill should be done in a particular way. Amongst other factors, the class, the level, the type of activity, the motivation of your group, access to digital devices and connectivity will influence your choice. It may therefore be easier to take a step-by-step, or in other words, a task-by-task approach. This means that as we analyze the coursebook material, rather than carrying out an analysis at a syllabus level or at a unit level, we may want to first look at each task individually. So an initial question we would ask ourselves as we look at a task is, do I need to be there for students to successfully carry out this task? So as we look at each task, one after the other, and ask ourselves this question, we'll probably realize that the majority of tasks don't necessarily require our live presence. So although this can vary from context to context, we may make the happy discovery that not having to be there as students carry out some tasks will free some of our time, which we'll be able to dedicate to other areas of our teaching. So before we move on to look at a practical example, I believe Sarah is going to help us with some criteria we could use to make this first decision between carrying out an activity synchronously or asynchronously. Isn't that right, Sarah?
Yes, and as you say, Fabio, of course, everybody's context is going to be different and the kind of students you have. But I think there are some, like this first question that you're asking, there are some useful statements here which may help you consider whether the activity you're looking at may be best done in a synchronous session or in an asynchronous session. So, for example, the first one, learners will need an immediate support. So does the teacher need to be there? As you said, Fabio, is obviously favors a synchronous session. And the next one, learners need to collaborate in real time to do the task. So obviously you either need to be in the classroom to collaborate, or in a virtual classroom so that they can actually do the activity together. And of course, if learners are going to be comfortable and happy doing the activity during that lesson, rather than needing to do it away from the live session. So that's also an important consideration. When we go to asynchronous, of course, the biggest one is, can the learners do this independently? As you said, Fabio, we can discover that actually learners can do a lot. If we encourage them and support them, they may be able to do that independently. And of course, learners will take a different amount of time to complete a task, which may be a reason why you want to allocate it as an asynchronous session, so that they do have time to take longer if they need it, or a faster learner can do perhaps more than one task, for example. And of course, learners may benefit from that extra thinking time in the rush of a classroom lesson where maybe time is limited. There may not be enough time to stop and reflect enough, whereas perhaps doing a task asynchronously would allow the learners the benefits of that extra time.
Absolutely, Sarah, and I'm sure those statements are going to help us with the next activity. So let's open our book and make this decision together. So this is the first page of a unit from the book we're using, which happens to be Open Word B2 first. So please have a look at the first activity, getting started, and let us know in the chat box whether you'd rather set this activity as a synchronous or as an asynchronous one. How would you approach it with your students? So let us know in the chat box, and you can type A if you want to do it synchronously, or B if you want to do it asynchronously. So we got an S, most of them. I suppose, Sarah, we are getting a great majority of A's, just a couple of, well, a few B's as well. Okay.
And of course, that will depend on your context.
Absolutely, yeah, of course it will. Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed answers, and yeah, it will definitely depend on the context, and for sure there's no right or wrong answer, just an answer that is right for you and for your learners. I suppose that once we've made that decision, another decision that we find ourselves having to make as we look at our course book and at our activity or resources, regardless of whether you are assigning them synchronously or asynchronously, is whether you'll assign the activity as one to be carried out individually, as pair work, or in groups. Most course books were designed to be mainly used in the live physical classroom. You may sometimes come to the conclusion that an activity designed to be carried out in pairs in the current context may actually fit the purpose better if carried out individually or in groups. So I suppose that so coming to summarize some of what we say, there are some tips that we'd like to share with you. So first thing is consider that synchronous activities, if we go for synchronous as most of you suggested, synchronous activities are particularly useful for collaborative practice and community building. And as you are no longer always present while students carry out their tasks, another tip would be that you could reallocate some of the time that you're saving by not necessarily always being there to dedicate your time to other activities such as lesson planning, providing personalized feedback, and monitoring students' progress.
Yeah, and I think actually, Fabio, the example you showed is a good one, because of course, if you are in a face-to-face classroom, you do have the opportunity to do it as pair work. If you're finding yourself in a virtual environment where it's more difficult to do pair work tasks, maybe you don't have breakout rooms, then you might decide to assign it asynchronously. And of course, there we need to think about tips for assigning asynchronous tasks. And I think probably the most important thing about this is really the clarity of instructions. When we're assigning tasks to be done away from the teacher is not there to clarify if the student has understood the instructions. The student can't ask for clarification about the tasks. So we really need to make sure that we've thought about those instructions and predicted any difficulty they might have with the task, and made sure we've included that. So absolutely essential to success of a synchronous task is this. And one of the things, of course, you can do is consider recording those instructions. They could be an audio recording or a video recording of the instructions. That personalizes it. The students see you, and of course, you know your group and you know your students, so you know what best to do in terms of the instructions. And of course, once you've done those instructions, you need to share them with your students. You may be able to share them through your LMS, your learning management system, or you may need to use another app like WhatsApp, Padlet, or similar. And we're going to show you an example of that in a moment. But I think Fabio's got something else to add to this too.
Yeah, sure. I think what you just said is actually a very good idea, and it's going to be very important. And one more thing, I suppose, that we mentioned at the beginning, one of the most common challenges for teachers and students is respectively providing and finding motivation. So this is why, where possible, we may want to share with students the objective and desired outcome for the task we're setting. If our students understand and know what's the benefit for them, they'll probably feel more motivated to do it. And as you promised just a second ago, Sarah, here are some examples of how audio and video recordings of instructions could be shared with students through WhatsApp video messages or Padlet. There are, of course, many other platforms and apps that allow you to do that. So
yeah, and if anybody wants to test this one out, the link works, and you can actually get there by the QR code.
yeah.
So that brings us to tip 3. So in the planning, of course, we also need to think about how we're going to give feedback. So in terms of time, when are we going to give the feedback on an activity? And space, where are we going to give that feedback? Is it possible to give them immediate feedback in some way? Are you lucky enough to have an LMS that actually auto marks some of those objective activities that you might be doing? So where the answer is correct or not correct, you may be able to use an auto marker, and perhaps you can add comments, suggestions to help those students who either found the task challenging and need a little bit more support. You can add that into the feedback, or you may also be able to lead the stronger students into a further activity through these kind of tools. So if you have tools that offer check that whether your tools offer autocorrection. If they don't, there are other options, and we'll show you a few. And the other question is, can you make the task more engaging by providing feedback, if you like, as part of a game or a kind of quiz, which actually provides feedback? And one of my favorites, and I'm sure lots of people use it, is Quizlet, which not only allows you to make feedback for flashcards to test vocabulary, for example, or grammar, that you can also use them to monitor that progress as a teacher. So here we see an example of the flashcard, and of course you can flip it and see the word runway on the back of it, but you can also share it through various platforms, the activity, and as a teacher you can monitor the individual progress if you want to in something like this app. Other things you can do, if you can't do it through your LMS, or if you want to make your own material, of course, is using something like Google Forms, which enables you to create tasks with a variety of different task types, multiple choice, gap fill, etc. And you can choose whether you provide the answer or immediately or later, etc. You can actually create auto-marked activities. if you're using Word, maybe you haven't really looked at using comments. So actually you can take a student's task and write comments against their work, as you can see in the example, including writing comments about their strengths and things to work on, not just about grammar mistakes. It gives you lots of opportunity to give positive, encouraging feedback and constructive feedback. Something as simple as using a correction code like you see on the screen now, where you choose particular aspects of the student's writing, and you can see on the left, and highlight them in color to encourage them to do their own correction. So you're giving them feedback, but not telling them the answers. And of course, you can do this in a face-to-face context, or you could do it digitally. And one of the things I think that we can exploit, of course, is recording feedback. And one of the things that you can use is screencasting, which allows you to record everything that is on your screen, and you narrate in a video what is happening on the screen. So if you have a student's piece of writing, like you can see on the screen at the moment, you can talk through the feedback and send the recording to your student. Again, much more personalized and easy to do. Promise me, if I can do it, it must be. Seriously, there are lots of apps, and this is just one to suggest.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very interesting and useful. So far, we've mainly been talking about allocating time. So let's come back to thinking about space. We used to know and be very familiar with the learning space when learning happened in our traditional classrooms. Now, in many cases, learning is taking place in physical spaces we, as teachers, don't necessarily know at all, in places previously hidden, which is to say, our students' homes. So despite the fact we don't know these spaces, we can still support our students to set them up in a way that would facilitate their learning. So we could, for example, remind our students to find an appropriate place to sit and to sit in a correct position, or help them to reflect on what they should or shouldn't have available to them on their desks. So a dictionary, a notebook, some stationery will be useful to have at hand. We can also advise them to get rid of things they don't need and could distract them. Which windows should I keep open in the browser? An online dictionary, for example, or their ebook, and which not? So maybe their social media, they shouldn't have them open unless you're using them for educational purpose, as we'll see later in an example. So apart from physical spaces, a world of opportunities is to be found in virtual spaces too. So be a video conferencing platform, a WhatsApp group, different social media, breakout rooms, or virtual backgrounds.
Yes, and virtual backgrounds is a very interesting topic, and we're just going to explore it very briefly now with some ideas to share with you. So Fabio is going to demonstrate as well. So over to you, Fabio.
Yeah, so where am I? Type in the chat box, please. You can observe I have a virtual background now.
Okay. So for those of you who can't see it very well, we'll put the same picture on the screen so that you can see the virtual background.
Yeah, and however, it seems that most people are getting it. Well, the picture
Great.
definitely helps. So Sarah, what's the tip here? How could we exploit the virtual background, such a restaurant one?
Yes, of course. The virtual backgrounds are great for role plays to make them feel more real and engaging, more realistic, motivating, in fact. So that's just one way. And then we have another background that you have to demonstrate for us.
Sure.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah, we can. And again, just to make it easier to see together, we put it on the screen as well. And of course, here we have a very practical example of using visual inputs like vocabulary or mind maps. And of course, we have Fabio demonstrating it for us. Very practical and very motivating, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very useful to to explore new spaces. So this is an opportunity we wouldn't have in a live classroom, in a live traditional classroom. And I suppose that the last thing to say here is that we could consider asking students to all use the same virtual background in a lesson to boost the sense of community. So I suppose this was our last piece of advice on how to exploit virtual backgrounds. And we are now moving on to exploring
social media.
Social media, yeah, exactly. So Instagram would be one. So let's now have a look at one way we could work creatively on presenting grammar structures following a flipped classroom approach and using social media. So in this case, we've taken Instagram as an example, although the same activity could be done on other social media or on most learning platforms. So we've called this activity Instagrammar, and it's a pretty simple activity to set up. And the first step would be to get students to look at the grammar structure they need to learn and summarize the rules in as simple and concise language as they can. We will then get them to create or find relevant examples, get them to set relevant concept check questions, and then finally get them to produce and edit a video clip of them presenting the grammar structure, which they then submit. They could post it on a social media, so on Instagram, for example, or they could post it in many other different places. So we had a look at Padlet earlier, so that could be also another place to post it. And then finally, set a price or different prices. So for example, the clearest video, the most creative one, or the best examples, or the best concept check questions, and then get your students to like the videos, and you'll have some winners. So we have a little example here. It's an homemade example that we're trying to present second conditional here. And I'm sure your students can do better than this. However, just for the sake of providing an example, you'll see me in action in a second.
So here we go.
If I won the lottery, I'd buy a tropical island. Could I win the lottery? Difficult, but not impossible. If I were you, I'd start recording my video right away. Could I be you? Impossible.
Great stuff, Fabio. Great.
Okay.
Thank you. So I think that actually brings us to the end of the session here. So just to recap our journey, we've been looking at space and time and exploring perhaps a redefinition of that and how we can exploit it with our resources and in allocating time and space in different ways than perhaps we were doing previously. Thinking about physical space, but also thinking about virtual space and the advantages and the opportunities that both offer us. Exploring the virtual space, we saw that example there of virtual backgrounds, and of course exploring Instagram as well. We just want to say a couple of things about resources before we actually go into the question, make some time for time and space for questions, but we'll just show you a few resources we think might be useful as a follow-up to this session. So Fabio.
Yeah, absolutely. So a good place to go is our blog, Word of Better Learning, and there you'll find a lot of informative articles, but also activities that you can use in your classroom, and it's constantly updated every week. And so go there and you will find things such as this article. If you could share the next slide, please, Sarah. Yeah, for example, planning distance planning distance and blended lessons, for example. And what else, Sarah?
Well, there are lots of things. I think there are lots of useful articles, and you'll find links to resources. And as you said, Fabio, it's updated all the time. So very relevant and really helpful. And I would also like to recommend, if you haven't already seen it, the Mooc, Teaching English Online. It just started in November, but it's not too late to join. You can join for free. It's a 4-week course which focuses on developing your skills for teaching online, digital resources and ideas for delivering effective lessons. It's suitable for experienced and less experienced teachers. And as I said, it's free. It's really very useful. And just to share with you that currently in this, on this Mooc, there are about over 250,000 participants enrolled, but there's still space for you. So if you haven't enrolled yet, it's not too late. And as I said, you can enroll for free. We also wanted to draw your attention to the My New Classroom, where you'll find lots of resources which are relevant for this challenging context, whether you're teaching face-to-face, in hybrid classrooms, blended learning, online. You'll find lots of ideas, coping with social distance, classrooms, emotional support for your learners, etc. You can see the topics here are very relevant, and of course teaching English online for those of you who are dealing with that challenge as well. So we'd like to recommend you have a look at those, and you'll be able to download lots of free resources, lesson plans, ideas, information about Cambridge English qualifications, etc. So we'll send you off to that one or two. So I think that actually brings us to the end.
Yeah, and to space and time for questions, I suppose.
Indeed. So we've got about just under 10 minutes for questions, which is great. Lots of positive comments coming in on the chat. Everyone's saying what a great session and thank you for all the practical tips. So really good feedback. So I'm just going to pick a few of the Q&A questions now. The first one is from Mariella. In the case of reception and foundation, the managing of time and space is considerably different, not only at the school setting, but also for virtual learning. What specific suggestions can you share about early years?
That's a good question.
It is. It's an interesting one, completely different. Do you want to start, Fabio?
Yeah, of course, the younger the students, the better, being sort of online with them. Sorry, not online, but in presence with them. However, there's a number of things that we could do with younger learners, and we may potentially opt for more kinesthetic activities that can still be done online. And so we can get students to sing and dance literally in front of a screen. But of course, we need to remember and consider that many of first of all, they can't really stand or be in front of a screen for too long, and therefore setting asynchronous tasks for them is also going to be very, very important. They will probably need support from their parents as well.
Yes, definitely. Working in collaboration with parents will be important in this context. I also think the use of time will be more limited. So obviously, younger students can't spend the same amount of time online.
Okay, thank you very much. We've had quite a lot of people asking for the link to the Teaching with Creativity for Young Learners. So if we can get that put in the chat, I'll see if I can get that link put in the chat for you. Okay, on to another question then. Some teachers are very wary of students sharing teacher audio and video recordings all over the internet. So what about the protection of teacher privacy? That's an anonymous question.
Very important question.
Would you like to go ahead with this, Sarah?
Well, I think one of the things that we obviously need to do, like in any teaching situation, is set some rules. And I think if you're working with younger students, you also probably need to involve parents as well to make agreement about the way materials are being shared. If you have a WhatsApp group, and obviously you could be sending material to the parents to pass to students. So if you have concerns like that, I definitely would involve parents in the equation if possible, or a responsible adult.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, the content of the material, audio or video that you share, could make it be less embarrassing if the content is appropriate. You may not want to be there online and shared by your students, but if just a video of you setting instructions for an activity, that shouldn't be too harmful, hopefully. But yeah, as Sarah suggests, good to get parents involved and sort of making sure that they can also help us control that.
Okay. We've had quite a lot of questions around virtual backgrounds, actually. That's come up quite a few times. Most of the questions sort of vary around where you can do them and where you can get them from. So can you just do them in Zoom, or can you do them in Teams and Google Classroom? And just kind of where can you get them from, really?
I think there's a couple of things to say. So, for example, some platforms offer the opportunity to use virtual platforms and some don't. But also there is a difference in the computer that you're using. So, for example, Zoom allows you to use virtual backgrounds, but my computer, which is a little bit older than Fabio's, doesn't allow me to use a virtual background. So in some cases, you will have a variety of, amongst your students who can use the background and can't use the background. So we, in fact, Fabio and I were talking about this. So having a plan B for any student who can't share a virtual background. So perhaps they will share a picture or something different. Fabio, do you want to add anything else?
No, I think that was a good answer, really. And yeah, of course, I mean, either sharing pictures in the chat box or just simply sharing a slide could be an alternative, maybe slightly less dynamic, but yeah, we do what we can with what we have.
Yeah, and the platforms themselves will usually offer a selection of pictures, but you can upload pictures from the website, from websites that you choose to use.
Yeah,
and obviously we recommend sites like Unsplash, where you're allowed to use the photos, because of course it's very important to respect copyright.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, the mind map that I was showing earlier as an example, that was just taken from the book I was using as a teacher, just a screenshot of that, and then I uploaded that onto Zoom very easily. So you got next to the camera icon, you got an option to activate a virtual background, and then you can add one and pick just any picture you have on your desktop.
Okay, great. We've got a few minutes left, so I think we've got time for a couple more. A question from Deepa. How do we differentiate in an online class?
Right.
Okay. I've got some ideas.
Yeah.
I think obviously some of that differentiation will become also between asynchronous and synchronous. But if we're talking about synchronous classes, if you are able to, you may be able to use breakout rooms, for example, on Zoom, and decide to actually group your students to do different activities. You might use a choice board, for example, and students would choose the breakout room that they're going to do the activity in. So you could have a variety of activities the student could choose, or of course the teacher can allocate the students to particular breakout rooms to do particular activities. However, if you're talking about differentiation, this is where asynchronous tasks give you great opportunity to tailor-made your activities for your students who have different levels or different needs.
Absolutely agree, Sarah. Yeah.
Okay. So we're getting a little bit short on time now. So I'm just going to see if there's any other questions here. You just see lots of stuff on virtual backgrounds. That's coming up a lot. Oh, there is one question here from Damara. The infographic you showed at the beginning of the session, is that available at Cambridge University Press's blog?
I wouldn't know about that really.
It's really new, isn't it, Fabio?
It's quite recent, and I got it from our internal resources, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Sorry, so I'm not sure I could answer to it, but probably the results, if they haven't yet been published, will
be at some stage. At some stage.
Maybe what a better learning.
Have a look at the blog. Yes.
Check the blog out. Okay, so we're out of time. We've only got about a minute left. So I just want to say thank you so much, Sarah and Fabio, for such an interesting session and all those practical tips. And you're getting lots of love out there, so well done. And thank you everyone for joining us today and for such great questions. Just a reminder before we end the session that you can download your certificate for the session by clicking on the link, and the session will be available to view again on our Cambridge ELT YouTube channel in just a few days' time. So I hope you're staying with us for the next and the final session for today, which is a digital futures session entitled How to Navigate the Kaleidoscope of Digital Pedagogy in Pre-Primary and Primary ELT with Christina Giannikis. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah and Fabio, and I look forward to seeing you all again in some of our other sessions this week. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.